Hello, my name is Michael Allen Rose. I am a Chicago based performer, musician, and writer. And I'm happy to once again be taking part in the Small Press Zine Fest. I'm going to share a little bit of my work with you today. One of the things that I've been doing for the last few years is maintaining a Patreon. And what I do with my Patreon is uh, I'm going to start that over, Sarah. All right. Hello, my name is Michael Allen Rose. I'm a Chicago based writer, musician, and performer, currently living in Oak Park on the edge of Chicago on the west side. I'm happy to once again be participating in the Small Press Zine Fest. I'm going to share a little bit of my work with you today from my Patreon series. What I've been doing for the past couple of years is maintaining a Patreon where every month I create a new zine or chapbook. And those are pretty wide ranging. I've done everything from sci fi and horror to comedy to just straight up absurdity to real life stuff. They're designed by me. Every month I've got new stuff for my patrons, which is really, really fun for me because it gives me a chance to not only share my work with a wider audience, but reward those people who want to support me with something really cool and ideally collectible. Um, I have a few publications with various small presses and things, but this is one of the really rewarding things because it's direct from the artist to the person who wants their art. But today, I am going to share a short story of mine from my most recent release, Stew. Stew is something I wrote a few years ago. It's one of those rare stories I've written that's based on a very real situation. It has a special poignancy for me. I'll read from the introduction here real quick. When I was young, one of my very best friends and I actually made the stew in this story. A few years, somewhere in the midst of our elementary school gross out years, it was a semi regular thing when we were bored in the summer, running around the neighborhood. And like the characters in this story, my friend and I had very different lives, something I realized more in retrospect than I did at the time. His home life was very different than mine. My dad yelled a lot, but his had real anger problems. I'm not sure if there was physical abuse or just emotional abuse. My mom would get upset. She never called me names. My friend's mom, I heard colorful insults all the time. My toys were taken care of. His were often broken. My dinners were home cooked, as little as I appreciated that at the time. His were usually ordered in or browsed for in the cupboards. We were best friends. We had very different lives. So this story was inspired by that and also from a writing prompt, which was amateur filmmaking. So without further ado, this is my short story, Stew. Now poop in it. Marty grinned from ear to ear, gesturing to the 1 gallon ice cream bucket between us. I felt my sphincter clench and my eyes widen at the thought of doing my business in front of anyone. I don't think. Come on, Chuck, it needs more ingredients. Poop is important. Making the stew had been a summer tradition since we were old enough to roam the neighborhood without supervision. But this was the first time we were filming it. As soon as the weather turned from winter and the world began to melt, Marty would show up at my doorstep, ice cream pail in hand, asking, "Can Chuck come out and play?" We would eschew video games and air conditioning for that first week, anticipating the smells and sounds of spring. Then, at Marty's behest, I would help him make the stew. As we'd gotten taller and bigger, our resources had grown. We were now able to reach the ripest, juiciest poison berries from the bushes in the alley. We could venture further out and find more exotic additives for the stew. Like the filthy discarded sock that Marty was now dropping gingerly into the bucket. I watched it bob for a moment, like a ship taking on water, and then soaking with blackness, it sank to the bottom of the sludge. This summer, we had my camera. We were making a movie. Maybe it was a documentary. Maybe a horror film. It was hard to tell. I don't have to go. Marty folded his arms like a caricature of an angry parent. Do you want to come over to my house and eat? We have leftover tacos from last night. Tomorrow. I'll make sure I don't go when I wake up. I'll save up. Marty squinted at me, shuffling back and forth. Finally, he shrugged. Maybe we can find some dog poop. He picked up a stick and put the bucket down in the middle of my dad's compost heap. That was the safest spot for the stew, at least during the week while my dad was at work. It was warm, pungent, and nobody went near it except my dad on the weekends when he tended his garden. Plus, if a worm or beetle fell into the stew, so much the better. I wiped the camera lens with my shirt. There were some spots of moisture clinging to it like dewdrops. I hoped it was just water. With the ingredients we were working with, it was hard to tell and best not to think about it for too long. This is going to be sick. Marty pulled out a dusty case, toys spilling out the edges. His figures were chewed and battered, a few missing arms or legs. Once the torture chamber is ready, these guys are so dead. He tapped the bucket with his toe. It sloshed menacingly. You want to let it cook for a while? He nodded. Later on, we'll walk around the alley, see if we can find more stuff. We played video games for a while, hiding from the midday sun. My Nintendo was in an air-conditioned basement. It was a lot more tolerable at my house in July than it was in Marty's room, where the underpowered fan circulated air thick with sweat and things unspoken. We hung out in my basement a lot most summers. I was in the middle of a jump, just about to crush a Koopa when Marty paused the game. Hey, Chuck! What? He set the controller down. I could hear him breathing. You ever want to run away? I pondered this. I don't know, I guess. Sometimes. We could live in the woods down by the park where we found that mattress. I bet we could steal food from the drugstore across the road for a while. I could get my sleeping bag. Yeah, I guess. I don't know. Why do you want to run away? Are you mad? Marty looked at me, flecks of gold dancing in his blue-gray eyes. His lids looked too heavy for his face, dark circles cradling each orbital socket like hammocks. He studied me carefully. Nothing, never mind. The game continued, my feet crushing the shell and making the Koopa retreat inside. I followed Marty down the alley that divided our houses. It sloped downward to intersect with a long, hilly cross street separating our neighborhood from a small wooded park and a large brick bank building. Marty had brought his stirring stick along, a useful tool, in case we came into contact with a stew ingredient that seemed caustic or otherwise too vile to touch with bare hands. As we walked, he drew sigils in the mud, the hieroglyphs of boredom and summer days. I cleared my throat. You want to come over and play Transformers? Maybe later, he said. Let's look for more ingredients. Marty led the charge across the street and into the small paved alcove where the bank dumpsters were located. Most of the bank's refuse wasn't worth going through, but on rare occasions, some special item would stand out and become the next addition to the stew. I got some new ones, I said. There's these ones that are monsters like sharks and dinosaurs and stuff. You put them all together and they make one huge one. Cool. Marty knew what I was talking about. He watched the same cartoons as I did. The difference was that my parents didn't mind buying me the toys. I was careful with my stuff. Marty often demolished whatever his folks bought him. Action figures would end up buried headfirst in the lawn to be dismembered by lawnmower accidents. Trucks would be smashed together until they devolved into their component parts. Soft things like cans of slime and stuffed animals would find new life as prank materials or occasionally as part of the stew. The summer had been different. I'd gotten a video camera from my parents for Christmas. For months, every single weekend, Marty would ask about it. When are we going to start shooting our movie, Chuck? Now that we were out of school, it was harder to put him off. Something about the idea of my friend Marty anywhere near my expensive gift terrified me, but somehow, as usual, he'd convinced me. I don't think of myself as gullible or easily coerced, but something about Marty always slithered under my skin and burrowed its way into my brain. I was spending the summer as his dutiful cameraman, ready to capture his horrific action figure torture porn. I just had to make him promise not to touch it. I was the cameraman. He was the director, writer, cast, wrangler, and alchemist. I trailed Marty down the alley, following a few steps behind, recording his actions. The colors looked different through this lens. Something about him looked off. He looked unhealthy and mean, kicking the ground, his skin taking on a ghastly whitish pallor. I could see blue veins throbbing underneath. Get some of those brown leaves and we'll throw them in. I turned to see a scattered carpet of dead leaves under an oak tree. It looked positively autumnal. Okay. I scooped up a handful of dry leaves with my other hand, crushing them into each other with my fist, powdered plant matter trickling from between my knuckles. We slunk back into my yard from the back, hopping the fence, and into the stew they went, floating in a mass near the top of the oily gray liquid. Marty quickly stabbed them with his stirring stick, sending the heap to the bucket floor like a sinking ship. I looked up quizzically at the trees. It was June, and in the 90s during the warmest parts of the day. There should be cottonwood buds floating through the air, conjuring a strange blizzard for the neighborhood. Instead, when I'd caught a glimpse through the camera, I thought I'd seen dead leaves and bent flowers. Hey, Chuck, you want to stir for a while? My arm's tired. Marty was holding the stick out, dripping end pointed downward like a dowsing rod, leaving droplets of filth glistening on the hard-packed earth. He'd left enough room for me to grab the stick without having to touch the horrible part, which I appreciated. While I stirred, he sat in the grass nearby, closing his eyes against the sun. Chuck, can I stay for dinner, you think? He was eyeing me warily. I dragged the stick through the thickening paste, scraping the bottom of the bucket. Parts of the sludge were thick enough to put up a fight. Tiring, I sat beside my friend, leaving the stick stabbed into the compost heap. I'll ask my mom. She probably won't mind. Marty nodded thoughtfully. Cool. Thanks. I noticed then that Marty seemed thinner than usual, especially his face. His mom didn't always make dinner, depending on how she was getting along with his dad. Sometimes we'd hang out in his room playing Nintendo and we'd hear them yelling at each other upstairs. Sometimes there would be a sound like something was breaking. Sometimes there'd be swearing or doors slamming. I didn't know how Marty did it, but he was somehow able to ignore all of that chaos, his eyes never wavering from the screen, the slight smile never leaving his face. If my parents had acted like that, I would have been a nervous wreck. It didn't seem to faze Marty. He stood and pulled a weed out of the soil at the edge of the fence, crushing it, a spray of chlorophyll staining his palm emerald green before he dumped the broken stalks into the bucket. That should be good for today. Let's let it cook. I dutifully helped him cover the sides of the bucket in grass clippings and leaves so nobody would find our handiwork. The smell of death lingered in the air as the bucket sloshed and my left eye watered. Marty didn't seem to notice. The next morning was mostly cloudy. Marty had been over, ringing my doorbell early in the morning. Rain will dilute the stew. We have to get to the climax shot. I thought about bringing the bucket into one of our homes and gagged a little. He was right. There was no way it could come inside. Even the garage would be suspect, especially if one of my parents unexpectedly came home and hit the bucket with the car and spilled it. I had no words to explain the stew to an adult. All right, let's go. I grabbed my camera and my jacket and we exited through the back door, making our way to the hidden project in the compost heap. Make sure you pan around, get a long drifting shot of the whole neighborhood, and then a nice slow zoom in on the stew. In his free hand, he held one of his action figures, some nameless soldier with a cartoonishly large gun. He had been tied up with rubber bands in a pattern eerily reminiscent of the creepy bondage video we'd found in a dumpster the summer before and watched while his parents were out of town. Okay, we're rolling. Slowly, I circled the camera around, finally coming to rest on Marty, dangling his figurine like a mad scientist in a pulp movie. The camera eye sparked visions. We were no longer just Chuck and Marty. Everything had become something wholly other. I imagined my friend dancing gleefully as our neighborhood turned ashen and dead. Twisted, splintered chunks of dead wood jutted from a fragmented ground. Shadows danced under a hazy violet sun that appeared chronically ill. The ground itself was melting and buckling in places, leaving cracks, coughing up the corpses of roots. There were no people walking on our street. I saw a curtain flutter in the breeze of an open window across the way. A loud cough later, a misty spray of ruby stained the curtain. I looked back to the stew. Marty stood over the kiddie pool full of negativity, stirring it with what appeared to be a human femur. His eyes were wild. He was the monster, the mad doctor, the evil dictator with his iron fist around the eternal victim, someone too small to fight back, who couldn't understand the workings of the situation well enough to find escape. Mwahaha! Lightning flashed, thunder pealed, ravens blackened the sky with 1,000 beating wings. I shook my head. It was a clear day. It's just a few clouds covering a lazy sun. What do you think you're doing? With a snap, he tore the tiny arm off the figure. He looked like he wanted it to bleed. You can't get away from this. There's nowhere to go. He gritted his teeth and slowly tore the figure in half, the black rubber band that held it together separating into shreds and finally pulling apart like sap. He dropped the legs into the stew. I imagined them going down to the bottom of some Stygian abyss. His knuckles bulged and turned white as he gripped the torso of the little soldier tight. Wind swirled around him, framing the shot with debris blown up from some old fable, sticks and leaves watching like eyes and caressing the edges like feelers from some forest spirit. He spoke for the soldier in a tiny, frightened voice. No, please, I'll be good, I promise. His own voice answered, bass creeping in to add weight. I've told you time and time again, but you never listen. I hate you. Now you're going to get it. What are you going to do? I asked, panning up to his face. Marty looked directly into the camera then. I felt like he was looking inside me. His eyes weren't meeting mine directly, but I could see behind his through the camera. It looked like urban blight, lost jobs, car accidents, and ill intent. But under all that was a wounded animal. It smells like death. The pupils dilated as he grinned, shutting the window to his inner self. Make sure you get everything. This will be the last scene where the victim gets swallowed whole. I kept filming as he plunged his fist into the stew. Thank you. If you are interested in my work, you can go to www.patreon.com/Michael Allen Rose. That's right. www.patreon.com/Michael Allen Rose. And you'll get a new zine or chapbook every month if you're interested in signing up for a subscription. I also have a number of my books and music available online. If you go to michaelallenrose.storeenvy.com. Or, of course, you can find out more about all of this at www.michaelallenrose.com. Thank you so much. And thanks to Sarah for putting an awesome festival together. Have a great one.